I have a story that I want you to share.
Oh,
Because from when I first heard this story, I really admired you for your willingness to do this. And this was the Arizona story. When you went to witness there, was that after a GA? I can't remember.
yeah, that was 2010.
Yeah. And you were among the people who allowed yourself to be arrested. And I think hearing stories like that were incredibly inspiring to me. Would you tell that story?
Absolutely.
Do you mind? Is this okay for me to ask you?
I would be happy to. You're the first interviewee to turn the tables on me, though. It's so interesting you bring up that story because it's so easy to take a look at one incident and think that that is somehow both the beginning and the end of the justice work, right? Like, yes, I went to Arizona and I got arrested with a bunch of other people and got thrown in Sheriff Joe Arpaio's 4th Avenue jail and got to spend the night there with a bunch of other people. It's a very dramatic story. It's a very dramatic moment, but there are so many threads that built up to that and so many ripples that came out after that was like where a wave crested for a moment.
That's a good way to say it.
And I think that when someone is trying to get their foot in the door with justice work, they're used to hearing about these waves cresting and feeling like, oh gosh, I could never do something like that. But that wasn't where it started. And I certainly didn't do it by myself. That certainly wasn't me alone accomplishing anything. It was very much part of an enormous web of stories and people interacting with each other and coming together. When I started seminary, part of the reason that I chose United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities was that they had, at that time, a global justice requirement for their degree programs. And I may be a little chagrined to admit this now, but I was a bit not excited about the destinations that were offered. And so I went to Professor Chris Smith, who was leading some of those trips. And I just asked her, like, why do we go to these places? Why should I be excited about this? Because I want to be excited about it, but I just obviously don't get it, right? And the way she talked about these relationships and these communities that were doing this important work, and her theology that built around paying attention to those on the margins and to ally your privilege with people who are oppressed, and tying it into U.S. complicity in international relations, and seeing her light up about it lit me up about it, right? That was all it took. So I went with her to Chiapas, Mexico that year, 2010, and it blew me wide open. It was a shift in understanding my place in the world and my relationship to others in the world. It was this sense of needing to get completely outside of anything that resembled familiarity, to be able to look back at home and see it in a new light and see it more for reality, for what it was, instead of my comfort zone, right? So
Yep.
I spent 10 days with Chris Smith and other students in Chiapas, Mexico, learning so much. It was just so beyond anything I had experienced in my nice Midwestern upbringing. And I came home from that trip smack into General Assembly in Minneapolis. Literally, plane landed, General Assembly was already underway, and suddenly I was there. And I was having like reverse culture shock. I have completely transformed. How is the world still the same? And
yes.
Here I am coming back from this trip surrounded by 5,000 UUs and the giant plenary hall. And they're all talking about immigration justice and immigration reform. I was like, I was just down there. And it was like this whole culmination. And we were voting about whether or not to have our 2012 General Assembly in Phoenix because of the immigration issues, or whether we were going to boycott our own General Assembly.
Yes, I remember this.
We're debating that, and I was like, wow, I had no idea that church polity could be so invigorating. And
yes.
And everyone voted to go down to protest in Phoenix for Justice GA 2012 and to reimagine what General Assembly could be as a justice GA rather than business as usual. And there was this huge surge of energy. And I remember our moderator, Ginny Corder, getting right up to that microphone and looking out at all of us who had just cheerfully and righteously voted for Justice GA to happen. And she said, if you just voted yes for this, you now have an obligation to actually show up for it.
Yep. Yep.
And there was kind of this, moment. I'm now responsible for making it happen. And this was 2010. That was going to be 2012. And right on the heels of that, someone stood up and said, 2012 is going to be powerful, but the work is happening right now, too. And we've been asked by organizers on the ground in Phoenix who are going to be impacted by SB 1070 that's going into effect next month. It's going to give Sheriff Joe and his deputies the right to go knock on people's doors and demand to see their papers. There's all sorts of things that are going to damage families and separate children and really make people scared to be anywhere without documentation that they're legally allowed to be in the U.S. These justice partners have asked us to show up for a day of non-compliance on the day that SB 1070 is going to go into effect at the end of July.
That's right.
And I was just so on fire from this building wave from, talking to Chris Smith and then going to Chiapas and then Justice General Assembly and all the voting. It was like, I have to go. I have to go.
Sure.
I couldn't not go.
Couldn't not go.
I couldn't not go. And that was July 2010. And I decided I was going to just get in my car and drive by myself from Minneapolis to Phoenix. And I was just going to show up and non-comply with everybody and see what happens.
I can just see you. Ooh, I'm on fire. Ooh, I'm on fire.
My mother was not thrilled at the idea of me driving my broken down car where, the air conditioning didn't work. And I was going to be driving through the desert in July. And I'd never driven in the mountains. And I'd never done a 5,000-mile road trip by myself. And a couple days before I was supposed to leave, I slipped and fell and broke a rib.
Oh, my.
And
my gosh.
But there was kind of like, are you sure you're going to go? I was like, yeah, I have to go. You have a broken rib. It's going to hurt no matter where you are. So I may as well be on a road trip through the national parks and getting arrested in Phoenix and, accomplishing what I had intended to. And so I did. And it was a life-changing experience. The road trip itself was a life-changing experience. The empowerment of knowing that I could just get in my car and go show up. That's all I had to do. And then there were people there waiting to receive all of the people who had signed up to come in. So I had home hospitality and we had training at the UU Church in Phoenix. Reverend Susan Frederick Gray was the minister at the Phoenix Church at the time. So she received us and we got to make that connection. And President Peter Morales came down for the Day of Noncompliance and I got to meet him. And there were so many people. It built up this intense, energetic connection among all the people who showed up for the Day of Noncompliance. There were those of us who got arrested, but there were also plenty of people who showed up and for their own reasons chose not to get arrested. There's lots of reasons in life why that is not the right choice for you. And so they were our support on the outside of the jail. And we had pro bono lawyers who had said that they were ready to represent the protesters getting arrested. And there were volunteer press people who were documenting and writing and blogging and making sure that the word was getting out about what was actually happening on the ground. There were people walking around with water bottles and granola bars, making sure that the protesters who were linking arms in the middle of the street and sitting there refusing to move weren't dying of dehydration or starving. And then I'll also say being in jail was an intense experience. Being in that particular jail was an intense experience. And I think by the time we got out, we'd been in jail for about 26, 27 hours, which was a lot longer than we thought it was going to be when we went in. We kind of assumed it was a formality that we'd be booked and we'd sit there for an hour or two and then be released because we were protesters. We weren't actually, damaging property or anything. And Sheriff Joe threw the book at us. And legally, he did not have to let us see a judge until we had been in jail for 24 hours. He let us see a judge at 23 hours, and then it still took another 2, 3, 4 hours to unbook us, whatever that process is.
Yeah.
So we were all sitting there, and some people were feeling pretty shaken. It was disconcerting, to say the least. You know, I won't get into all the weird mind tricks that they were playing on us for 20-some hours. It was not for the faint of heart. And it took more fortitude than I had at the age of 20, whatever I was when I did that. So by the end of that, you're cold and you're sleep deprived and you're starving and just so disoriented from normal life. It was really easy to just start worrying that we were going to be trapped in there indefinitely. We had no contact with the outside world, so we couldn't know where we were in our own process, and we just kind of had to trust that those lawyers were doing everything they could to get us out of there. And we were sitting in that cell, exhausted, and then we heard drumming, and we realized that we weren't that far from the outside after all. We hadn't been left behind or forgotten, and it was all one big community that was there for justice. And some of us were in the jail, some of us were drumming, some of us were lawyering, some of us were, preparing snacks, some of us were getting ready for an evening worship service to receive us after we were released from jail.
Some were writing checks, some were, all the ways. I love this story. I remember now the story of the drumming and that you could hear it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.